In the summer of 1066, England was thrown into turmoil as the throne stood vacant following the death of Edward the Confessor. In the north, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada formed an alliance with Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of King Harold Godwinson of England, and landed on the coast of Yorkshire with the ambition of claiming the crown. They believed Harold was preoccupied with the threat from Normandy in the south, and that the north would not be able to react in time. After defeating the local English forces at Fulford on 20 September, the Norwegian army advanced on York, compelling the city to hand over hostages. They encamped at Rickle south of York, and on the morning of 25 September marched eastwards to a stone bridge spanning the River Derwent at Stamford Bridge to receive the hostages as agreed. They did not expect that Harold Godwinson had undertaken a lightning march from London to the north, covering nearly 300 kilometers in just 4 days. Before the sun had fully risen, the English army was already closing in. That morning, a thin mist lingered over the narrow fields between the village of Stamford and the River Derwent. The Norwegian forces were divided into two main bodies. A large part of the army, including elite warriors and King Harold Hardrada himself, stood east of the bridge on higher ground overlooking the river. On the other side, an advance guard held the crossing. They were not fully armored. The weather was unusually warm, and many warriors had left their mail shirts at Rickle. When dark shapes appeared in the west, at first mistaken for the expected hostages, it was already too late. It was the full strength of Harold Godwinson's army, advancing rapidly across open ground in close formation, shields locked together. By mid-morning, the Norwegian vanguard clearly recognized the danger. They had no time to deploy fully before the Anglo-Saxon spearhead was upon them. The bridge became a deadly bottleneck. According to later accounts, a single Norwegian warrior stood in the middle of the bridge, wielding a two-handed Danish axe and holding back the English army. The bridge was so narrow that only a few men could fight at once. He held his position long enough for the troops east of the river to reform their lines. The English attempted to force their way across but were driven back. Shield struck shield. Axe blades crashed against spear shafts. The swift-flowing river below prevented either side from spreading out to flank. Harold Godwinson ordered his men not to pause. A small group managed to maneuver beneath the bridge by boat, thrusting spears upwards from below. At last, the defender fell. The Anglo-Saxon forces surged across. On the eastern bank, Harold Hardrada quickly grasped the situation. He drew up his men in a broad crescent formation, their rear angled towards the road leading back to Rickle. The formation was designed to prevent encirclement and to present a wide front against the assault. Harold Godwinson did not wait. He formed his troops into a shield wall, a living barrier of wood and steel, ranks of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, shields touching, spears projecting forward. The two masses of steel collided. Axes struck shields with sharp, splintering blows. Spears searched for gaps between the wooden boards. When one man fell, the space was instantly filled. There was no room to maneuver, no cavalry. Only the crushing weight of bodies and iron pressing against one another. At first, the Norwegians held their ground. They were seasoned warriors who had campaigned across Europe. Hardrada, tall and clad in a blue cloak, rode along the line, shouting orders and rallying his men. Then an arrow flew. It struck him in the throat. Harold Hardrada fell from his horse. In that moment, the center of the Norwegian line faltered. News of the king's death spread rapidly. Disorder rippled through the ranks. Tostig Godwinson immediately stepped forward to take command. He did not retreat. He reformed the line and maintained the crescent formation, awaiting reinforcements from Rickle, where the remainder of the Norwegian army was stationed. Harold Godwinson saw the instability and ordered his men to press forward, denying the enemy any chance to reorganize. The two shield walls crashed together once more. Blood began to stain the grass along the banks of the Derwent. As news of Hardrada's death spread along the line, dust began to rise from the southern road from Rickle. It was the remainder of the Norwegian force, the warriors who had left their armor at the camp, now alerted to the danger and hurrying towards Stamford Bridge. On the eastern field beside the Derwent, Tostig Godwinson maintained his defensive crescent. He concentrated his most experienced warriors at the center, where Harold Godwinson was pressing hardest. The Norwegian formation tightened into a narrow horseshoe, its wings attempting to maintain distance to avoid being outflanked. Harold understood that if the Rickle force joined the battle in good order, the outcome could change. He ordered his front line to maintain the pressure. The Anglo-Saxon shield wall advanced steadily. They did not charge wildly but pushed forward in rhythm, using the weight of the entire formation to grind against the enemy. The distance between the two lines shrank to only a few paces. Danish axes from both sides rose and fell. Shields split, spears snapped. The warriors in the front ranks had no room to retreat. Those who fell were trampled underfoot. Tostig rode forward, striving to maintain morale. He called on his men to hold fast until reinforcements arrived. But the crescent was steadily compressed. Behind them lay a gentle slope towards Rickle. To the right the river, to the left open ground. There was little space left to maneuver. Around midday, the force from Rickle finally arrived. They had run the long distance under the unseasonably hot sun. Many had not had time to don their mail. As they neared the battlefield, they did not pause to regroup, but hurled themselves against the English left in a desperate charge. The sudden impact caused the Anglo-Saxon left flank to waver. Part of the shield wall bent under the pressure. The newly arrived Norwegians, though exhausted, fought fiercely to open a gap and relieve the center. Harold reacted immediately. He moved reserves from the rear to reinforce the threatened flank. There was no cavalry for swift counterattack. All were heavy infantry. The redeployment was slow but disciplined. Both sides became locked in a brutal struggle. At the center, later accounts claim that Harold offered Tostig his life if he would abandon the Norwegian cause. Tostig refused. He remained within the tightening ring. The battle was no longer two stable walls. The formations began to tear apart. Small groups broke off and fought at close quarters. The field became a patchwork of savage clashes across the grass. At first, the Norwegian reinforcements managed to push the English left back several dozen paces. But the cost was exhaustion. They had run hard and then thrown themselves into combat. Before long their breathing faltered, and the arms that swung their axes slowed. Harold waited for that moment. He ordered a general advance along the entire line. The shield wall was reformed in sections. Anglo-Saxon commanders shouted for their men to hold formation. They did not chase scattered groups but advanced as a solid mass, gradually forcing the Norwegians back towards the Rickle road. Tostig was killed within the encirclement. When he fell, the last pillar of Norwegian command collapsed. There was no longer a leader of sufficient authority to coordinate the battle. The force from Rickle now fought without unified command. Some attempted to establish a new line to the rear. Others began to withdraw southwards, but there was little room to retreat. The road to Rickle became a corridor of blood. The English did not allow them to disengage. The exhausted Norwegians fought and fell back step by step under the relentless pressure of the Anglo-Saxon shield wall. By mid-afternoon, the Norwegian formation had completely disintegrated. There was no longer a crescent, no clear line, only scattered clusters of men fighting before being overwhelmed. The sun still beat down. Iron armor grew hot against the skin. Both sides were exhausted, but the English, who had arrived prepared for battle, maintained steadier cohesion. The ground east of the Derwent was strewn with bodies and broken shields. The surviving Norwegians began to flee towards Rickle. Harold did not allow a pause. He ordered pursuit. Once the Norwegian line collapsed, the battlefield ceased to be a single front and became a stream of men fleeing southwards. The road to Rickle, where the fleet lay anchored on the River Ouse, was their only escape. Harold did not permit his army to halt for long. He understood that if the enemy managed to establish a defensive line at the camp in Rurm, the fighting might continue into the next day. He ordered immediate pursuit as soon as the eastern front at Stamford Bridge had fallen. The Anglo-Saxons advanced in large groups, maintaining cohesion to avoid sudden counterattacks. The lightly armored Norwegians ran ahead, trying to widen the distance. Behind them were the wounded and the exhausted, who were steadily overtaken. Along the narrow track, small Norwegian groups turned to resist in order to buy time. They raised short shield lines in an attempt to block the advance. Each time the English deployed, pressed forward, broke them, and continued. There was no negotiation and no respite. The distance from Stamford Bridge to Rickle was not great, but for men who had fought for hours under the hot sun, it was punishing. By the time the first ships of the Norwegian fleet came into view, most of their formation had collapsed. At Rickle, the remaining Norwegian troops guarding the ships hastily organized a temporary defense around the landing place. They set shields in a line before the gangways, attempting to secure the route of escape. But they had no time to construct a proper defensive position. The fugitives from Stamford Bridge arrived in confusion. Units were no longer distinct. There was no supreme commander. News that both Harald Hardrada and Tostig had been killed reached the ships, further crushing morale. Harold halted his men briefly to reform before attacking the landing area. He did not wish to launch a disorderly assault into a confined space where desperate resistance might prove costly. Once the line was restored, the English advanced for the final time. The fighting at Rickle was brief but fierce. The remaining Norwegian warriors formed a defensive ring around the road to the ships. They fought with the knowledge that behind them lay their only hope of survival. But the English now held a decisive advantage in organization. They pressed from multiple directions, preventing the Norwegians from concentrating their strength at any single point. Sections of the defense were broken apart. Survivors cast aside their shields and scrambled onto the ships in chaos. Some vessels departed overcrowded. Others were abandoned for lack of rowers. According to later sources, of the hundreds of ships that had carried the Norwegian army to England, only around 24 returned with enough men to sail home. By late afternoon, the clash of weapons began to fade. The landing place at Rickel was covered with bodies and debris. The River Ouse carried blood and fragments of wood slowly downstream. The battle was over. Harold Godwinson stood amid the greatest victory of his military career. He had shattered the invasion from the north, slain one of the most renowned warriors in Europe, Harald Hardrada, and destroyed the Norwegian and Northumbrian alliance in a single day. But the cost was heavy. The English army had marched at speed from London to the north, fought throughout the day under intense heat, and then pursued the enemy to Rickel. They were exhausted. Many experienced warriors had fallen. Only 3 days later, news arrived from the south that William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey. Harold was compelled to turn his army south at once. A second march began. Stamford Bridge brought the age of Viking invasions of England to an end. Yet it also drained the strength of the Anglo-Saxon army at the very moment it was needed most. 20 days later, at Hastings, another battle would decide the fate of the kingdom. On the field of Stamford Bridge, the evening wind moved across broken shields. The cries of battle had fallen silent. Only the traces remained of a day when two armies had clashed without mercy, and one had never returned home.